Book nibbles. Big ideas. Small bites. Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air is one of those books that lingers with the reader long after the last page, not only because it chronicles a gripping true story of survival and tragedy at the world's highest peak, but also because it forces us to reflect on ambition, hubris, mortality, and the costs of chasing impossible dreams. The book is Krakauer's personal account of the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, when a sudden storm caught multiple expeditions high on the mountain and claimed the lives of experienced climbers and clients alike. Yet it is not just a recounting of catastrophe. It is also a meditation on what drives people into such extreme environments, what mistakes and miscalculations accumulate into disaster, and what the mountain itself demands of those who dare approach its summit. To tell this story, Krakauer weaves together his own experiences as a participant, the backstories of fellow climbers, and the history of Everest climbing culture, creating a continuous narrative that is as much about psychology and society as it is about ice, altitude, and weather. He begins by situating Everest in its mythic place. For decades, the mountain, 29,029 feet above sea level, the highest point on Earth, was a place of almost mystical allure. Early expeditions in the 1920s through the 1950s treated the mountain as a near-impossible challenge, and summiting it was seen as the ultimate triumph of human endurance. By the time Krakauer's expedition approached in 1996, Everest had been climbed many times, yet it still retained that aura of danger and prestige. However, what had changed significantly was the rise of commercial expeditions. Guides began offering packages to clients, some of whom had relatively modest mountaineering experience, promising that with the right support, even ordinary people could stand on the top of the world. This commercialization created new dynamics, new risks, and new incentives, because guides were torn between the responsibility to keep clients safe and the financial and reputational pressure to deliver them to the summit. Krakauer himself was there not only as a climber, but also as a journalist. He had been commissioned by Outside magazine to write about the growing business of guided climbs on Everest. Originally, the assignment was supposed to involve him climbing only part of the way, but Krakauer persuaded his editors to allow him to attempt the summit as part of Rob Hall's highly regarded adventure consultants team. This dual role, as both participant and observer, shaped his perspective and the narrative of the book. He was not just a reporter on the sidelines. He was gasping for breath, battling exhaustion, making the same decisions under pressure as those whose stories he tells. His account is colored by guilt as well, since he survived when others did not, and he later questioned every step, every choice, every unnoticed sign that might have made a difference. The journey began months before the summit push, with acclimatization and preparation. The adventure consultants team, led by Rob Hall of New Zealand, gathered at base camp on the south side of Everest in Nepal. Hall was a legend in the guiding world, a climber with 5 previous ascents of Everest, meticulous in planning, known for his professionalism and care for clients. His partner on the mountain that year, Scott Fisher of the Mountain Madness expedition, was another accomplished guide, charismatic, energetic, with a different but complementary style. Both were running teams of paying clients, supported by Sherpas, the highly skilled Nepali climbers who carried loads, fixed ropes, and prepared the route. Life at base camp was a study in contrasts. The bleak, icy, rocky landscape of the Khumbu Glacier, littered with tents, equipment, and supplies, filled with people from around the world speaking different languages, but united by a single goal. Krakauer paints vivid portraits of his fellow climbers. Doug Hansen, a postal worker from Washington State, had attempted Everest with Hall the previous year and had been forced to turn back near the top. This was his second chance, and he was determined to succeed. Beck Weathers, a Texan pathologist, had a larger-than-life personality and struggled with poor eyesight that required corrective surgery, but he too dreamed of the summit. Yosuko Nomba, a petite Japanese woman in her late 40s, had already climbed 6 of the 7 summits and needed only Everest to complete the set. Each client brought their own motivations: personal redemption, the desire for recognition, the hunger for adventure, but all placed their trust in Hall's expertise. From base camp, the expedition moved in stages, climbing up to higher camps and then back down again, allowing their bodies to adjust to the thin air. The route took them through the treacherous Khumbu icefall, a constantly shifting maze of seracs, crevasses, and ladders. The icefall was one of the most dangerous parts of the climb, where a single collapse could bury climbers alive. Yet it was the only way forward, and the Sherpas heroically carried loads through it repeatedly to stock the higher camps. Beyond the icefall lay Camp 1, then Camp 2 in the western Coombe, a broad, flat valley of ice that acted like a solar oven during the day, baking climbers under relentless sun despite the cold. Then came Camp 3 on the Lhotse face, perched precariously on steep ice, and Camp 4 on the South Col, the final staging ground before the summit push. Throughout these stages, Krakauer describes the effects of altitude on the body. At extreme elevations, oxygen levels are a third of those at sea level. Simple movements feel exhausting, thinking becomes sluggish, judgment deteriorates. Climbers experience headaches, nausea, insomnia, and sometimes more severe conditions like pulmonary or cerebral edema, where fluid accumulates in the lungs or brain. Acclimatization helps, but there is no true adaptation to such extreme altitude. Above 26,000 feet lies the death zone, where the body cannot sustain itself, and every minute spent is a countdown to deterioration. In such an environment, even small errors can prove fatal, and the line between pushing through hardship and crossing into collapse is razor-thin. The summit attempt in early May 1996 brought multiple teams onto the same route at the same time, creating bottlenecks. Hall's adventure consultants, Fisher's Mountain Madness, and several other groups all aimed to reach the top on May 10th, after days of waiting for a weather window. The plan, as Hall had always emphasized, was to have a strict turnaround time. If climbers had not reached the summit by 2 p.m., they must turn back, regardless of how close they were. This rule was crucial because descending in the dark or in worsening weather could be deadly. Yet on summit day, many climbers were delayed. Ropes had not been fixed in certain sections, creating weights on the steep slopes. The sheer number of climbers caused slow progress. By the time many reached the summit, it was well past the safe cut-off. Krakauer himself reached the summit at around 1 p.m., later than ideal but still within what seemed manageable. From the top, the view was breathtaking, an otherworldly panorama of peaks stretching into the distance. Yet even in that moment of triumph, Krakauer felt uneasy, aware of how late it was and how exhausted he was becoming. He descended, struggling with fatigue and disorientation, but managed to make it back toward Camp 4 before the worst of the storm hit. Others were not so fortunate. As afternoon turned to evening, a violent blizzard descended on the upper mountain. Winds howled, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and temperatures plunged. Climbers who had lingered on the summit or on the way down found themselves caught in whiteout conditions. Among them were Doug Hansen, who had finally reached the top with Hall's help after his previous year's disappointment, and Yosuko Nomba, who had also summited. Both were desperately slow on the descent, and Hall stayed with Hansen, refusing to abandon him. High on the south summit, Hall radioed down to base camp, reporting their dire situation. Eventually Hansen collapsed and died. Hall himself became stranded, unable to descend, and despite efforts to coordinate a rescue, he remained on the mountain overnight in freezing conditions. Over radio, he spoke to his wife in New Zealand in a heartbreaking farewell before succumbing to the elements. Scott Fisher, the other expedition leader, also fell victim. Already weakened by illness and fatigue before summit day, Fisher struggled on the descent and became incapacitated near the balcony. Sherpas tried to assist him, but he deteriorated quickly. He was left behind in the storm and died on the mountain. Meanwhile, groups of climbers including Beck Weathers and Yosuke Nomba were caught in the storm just above Camp 4, disoriented and unable to find their way back. They collapsed together in the snow, some semi-conscious, some already dead. In a remarkable twist of fate, Weathers, who had been left for dead after lying motionless for hours in sub-zero cold, somehow revived and stumbled back into camp, his face and hands horribly frostbitten, but alive. Nomba did not survive. The chaos of that night is the heart of the book, told in harrowing detail. Krakauer recalls the confusion, the limited communication, the desperate attempts by Sherpas and other climbers to locate missing teammates, and the crushing realization the next morning of how many lives had been lost. In total, 8 climbers died during the storm, making it one of the deadliest days in Everest history. The disaster shocked the mountaineering world and ignited intense debate about the ethics of guiding, the commercialization of Everest, and the decisions made by individuals and leaders that day. Krakauer does not shy away from examining his own role. He questions whether he could have done more to help, whether he missed opportunities to intervene, whether his presence as a journalist influenced decisions. Survivor's guilt permeates his narrative, and he is unsparing in critiquing both himself and the larger system that put so many unprepared climbers on the mountain. He reflects on how small delays, like fixing ropes later than planned, or clients moving slower than expected, cascaded into catastrophe. He also acknowledges the almost impossible pressures faced by Hall and Fisher, caught between professional responsibility and the promises made to clients who had invested immense money and dreams in reaching the summit. At the same time, Krakauer honors the heroism displayed by many. Sherpas risked their lives repeatedly to rescue clients. Climbers who were themselves exhausted gave what help they could. Beck Weathers' survival was a near miracle of human resilience and stubbornness. Yet the overall picture remains sobering. Even the strongest, most experienced climbers can be undone by altitude, weather, and the smallest miscalculation. Everest is indifferent to human ambition, and nature holds the final word. As the narrative winds down, Krakauer broadens his scope again to reflect on the meaning of Everest in modern culture. The commercialization of the mountain, he argues, contributed to the tragedy by encouraging people with insufficient experience to attempt it under the assumption that money and guides could guarantee success. But Everest is not Disneyland. It remains one of the harshest environments on Earth, and no amount of planning can erase its risks. Krakauer suggests that the disaster should serve as a cautionary tale about the limits of human control and the price of overconfidence. The book closes with Krakauer's attempt to come to terms with what happened. He acknowledges that no account can be fully objective. Memory is fallible, perspectives differ, but he offers his story as honestly as he can, both as a personal catharsis and as a record for others. His writing captures both the grandeur of the mountain and the brutal reality of what it demands. Readers are left not only with a sense of awe, but also with a sobering awareness of how fragile human life is in such extremes, and how easily ambition can shade into recklessness. Into Thin Air is therefore more than just an adventure story. It is an inquiry into why people take such risks, what it means to push beyond ordinary limits, and how tragedy unfolds not from one catastrophic mistake, but from a series of small decisions, delays, and misfortunes that accumulate until they become irreversible. Krakauer's voice, haunted, reflective, at times accusatory and at times deeply self-critical, makes the book as much about moral reckoning as about physical survival. It reminds us that nature is vast, impartial, and unyielding, and that in chasing the summit of the world, we may discover not only the limits of our endurance, but also the deepest truths about our own vulnerabilities. And that's it. Jon Krakauer's Into Thin Air. Thanks for listening to Book Nibbles. If you enjoyed this bite-sized book, don't forget to subscribe for more quick, insightful summaries. See you in the next nibble.